The Absolute at Large by Karel Čapek. Translated by David Wyllie. Performed by Francis Bass. Chapter 23. Conspiracy in Augsburg. Before 11 o'clock in the evening, the editorial office received the following message by telephone. Czech Press Agency, Munich, 12 February. Reports have been received of bloody demonstrations taking place in Augsburg. 70 Protestants killed. Demonstrations continue. Czech Press Agency, Berlin, 12 February. Official report that the number of dead and injured in Augsburg is no more than 12. Police maintaining order. Special report, Lugano, 12 February. Reliable reports that number of victims in Augsburg already exceeds 5,000. Railway communications to the north suspended. Bavarian ministry in permanent session. German emperor cancelled hunting trip to return to Berlin. Czech Press Agency, Reuters, 12 February. At 3 a.m. today, government of Bavaria declared holy war against Prussia. Cyril Kebbel was in Bavaria by the following day, and the following lines were taken from his relatively reliable description. In the Scholler pencil factory in Augsburg, on the 10th of February, at 6 in the evening, a Protestant clerk was beaten up by working-class Catholics in a dispute to do with the cult of Mary. The night passed without incident, but the following day at 10 in the morning, Catholic workers walked out of all factories and workplaces and loudly demanded the dismissal of all Protestant employees. Scholler, the factory owner, beaten to death, 2 managers shot. Cleric violently forced to carry a monstrance at head of procession. Archbishop Linz arrived to attempt to calm demonstrators, but thrown into River Lech. Leaders of Social Democratic Party tried to speak, but forced to flee into synagogue. 3 p.m., synagogue blown up with dynamite while Jewish and Protestant shops looted. Gunfire heard and several fires burning. City Council voted in support of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary and called fervently to all Catholics of the world to grasp the fiery sword and defend their faith. Other towns in Bavaria responded to this call. Munich, 7 p.m., a group of people enthusiastically supported a resolution for the southern regions to separate from the German Empire. Government in Munich notified Berlin that it would be taking on all responsibilities. The Imperial Chancellor, Dr. Wurm, went immediately to the Ministry of War, which sent 10,000 infantrymen into Bavaria from Saxony and the Rhineland. 1 a.m., the train carrying these troops is derailed at the Bavarian border, injured men machine-gunned down. 3 a.m., the government in Munich, in alliance with the Alpine lands, declares holy war on Lutherans. In Berlin, it seems they still have not lost hope that the whole misunderstanding might be resolved peaceably. The Emperor is at present speaking in Parliament, saying that he knows neither Catholic nor Protestant, but only Germans. Armies from North Germany are said to be concentrated along a line from Erfurt to Gotha to Kassel. Catholic forces are converging on the cities of Zwickau and Rudolstadt, meeting resistance only from civilians. Greiz has been burned to the ground, many residents killed, others taken into slavery. Rumors of major battles so far unconfirmed. Refugees from Bayreuth report hearing cannon fire from the north. Railway station in Magdeburg said to have been bombed to ruins from Bavarian aircraft. Weimar in flames. Indescribable enthusiasm here in Munich. Recruitment offices operating in all schools. Queues of volunteers waiting in the street for up to 12 hours. Flag of the 12 pastors hoisted above the town hall. Catholic priests have to perform Mass day and night in churches crammed with celebrants. Father Grosshuber, the Member of Parliament, collapses and dies at the altar. Jews, monists, abstinents, and other members of different faiths have barricaded themselves in their homes. Rosenheim, the banker and leader of the Jewish community, publicly burned this morning. The ambassadors of Holland and Denmark have had their passports taken. Representative of the USA submitted formal protest at the breach of the peace, whereas the Italian government assured Bavaria of its neutrality and its good wishes. Armies of new recruits marching down the streets carrying flags of a white cross on red background and proclaiming, "The will of God." Almost all women entering nursing service and preparing hospitals. Shops and offices mostly closed. Stock exchange likewise. That was the 14th of February. On the 15th, a major battle took place on the banks of the river Very, causing the Protestant forces to retreat. On the same day, the first shots were fired on the border between Belgium and Holland. England ordered mobilization of its navy. 16 February. Italy allows Spanish forces free passage across its territory to come to the aid of Bavaria. Tyrolean peasants armed with scythes hurl themselves at the Swiss. 18 February. Anti-Pope Martin sends a telegram giving his blessing to the Bavarian army. Undecisive battle near Meiningen. Russia declares war on Catholics in Poland. 19 February. Ireland declares war on England. Anti-Caliph emerges in Brussels, unfurling the green flag of the prophets. Balkan states mobilize, massacre in Macedonia. 23 February. North Germans' front line broken through, general uprising in India, Muslims declare holy war against Christians. 27 February. War between Italy and Greece, first conflicts on Albanian territory. 3 March. Japanese fleet sets out eastwards against America. 15 March. Crusaders, Catholic, lay siege to Berlin. Union of Protestant states established in Stettin. German Emperor Caspar I takes personal command. 16 March. Army of 2 million Chinese attack across border into Siberia and Manchuria. Army of anti-Pope Martin conquers Rome. Pope Urban flees to Portugal. 18 March. Spain demands that Portuguese government surrender Pope Urban to them. Refusal leads to de facto war between those countries. 26 March. South American states issue ultimatum to USA. They demand an end to prohibition and an end to freedom of religion. 27 March. Japanese forces disembark on the coasts of California and British Columbia. This, roughly speaking, was the world situation on 1 April. Central Europe was undergoing major conflict between Catholics and Protestants. The Protestant Union ousted the Crusaders from Berlin, maintained hold of Saxony, and occupied Bohemia, which had been neutral. The headquarters in Prague enjoyed the peculiar advantage of having Major General Wrangel from Sweden among them, who may well have been descended from the General Wrangel who took part in the 30 Years' War. On the other hand, the Crusaders took control of the Netherlands, which they then flooded with seawater by digging through the dikes. From the Netherlands they went on to take possession of Hanover, Holstein, and Lubeck, and on into Denmark. War was waged without mercy. Cities were razed to the ground, men were killed, any woman under 50 was raped. But the first thing invading armies did was to destroy the enemy's carburetors. Those who remember this exceptionally bloody war assure us that both sides fought with supernatural strength. There seemed sometimes to be an invisible hand that would take hold of enemy aircraft and hurl them to the ground, or a 54-centimeter shell would be caught in midair and thrown back where it had come from. Some of the most horrifying scenes took place when carburetors were being destroyed. As soon as any enemy city was occupied, there would be an invisible but desperate battle around the local carburetors. Sooner or later there would be a whirl of bricks and beams and roofing tiles thrown into the air above the carburetor as if you had blown into a pile of feathers, leaving the carburetor and the building that had housed it completely destroyed. This whirlwind would usually coincide with a tremendous explosion which leveled all the trees and buildings within a radius of up to 12 kilometers and left a hole in the ground more than 200 meters deep. The size of the explosion, of course, varied according to the size of the carburetor. Suffocating gases were released that spread to a distance of 300 kilometers, leaving vegetation a burnt brown color. This cloud, though, would often stop spreading out and frequently return to the place where it had started, again because of the strategic application of supernatural forces, making this strategy unreliable, and it soon stopped being used. It was seen that the Absolute could attack, but it could also defend. Weapons previously unheard of, earthquakes, tornadoes, acid rain, floods, angels, plague, locusts, etc., were used in combat, and it became essential to invent new strategies. Mass attacks, lines of trenches, front lines, fortified stations, and similar nonsense passed out of use. Each soldier was given a knife, bullets, and a few bombs and went out independently to attack any soldier wearing a cross of a different color on his breast. There were no longer two armies face to face against each other. There was simply a given area that was the theater of war, where both sides advanced and soldiers killed each other one by one until it could be seen who that land now belonged to. It was, of course, an especially bloody way of waging war, but it showed its strength in the end. That was the situation in Central Europe. Early in April, the Protestant armies penetrated through Bohemia and into Austria and Bavaria, while the Catholics overran Denmark and Pomerania. Holland, as stated above, had by this time disappeared from the map of Europe altogether. In Italy, there was a furious internal war between the supporters of Pope Urban and those of Pope Martin, while Sicily found itself in the hands of the Greek light infantry. The Portuguese occupied Asturia and Castile, but lost Extremadura where, down in the south, the fighting was fiercest of all. England fought on Irish soil and then in its colonies, but by the start of April held no more than the coastal strip of Egypt. Other settlements were lost and the colonists were massacred by the natives. With the help of forces from Arabia, Sudan, and Persia, Turkey overran the whole of the Balkans and had taken control of Hungary before a disagreement broke out between the Shiites and the Sunnis over some matter to do with Ali, the fourth caliph, which clearly must have been of the highest importance. Both sects had moved from Istanbul to Slovakia with the greatest speed, but also with the greatest bloodshed, which, unfortunately, affected the Christians. So it was that this part of Europe once again suffered worse hardship than anywhere else. Poland disappeared, swept away by the Russian army, which was now directing its attention to the Yellow Peril moving northwestwards. At the same time, there were 10 brigades of the Japanese army disembarking on the coast of North America. You may have noticed that there has been no mention so far of France. The chronicler has reserved this subject for chapter 24. Chapter 24. Napoleon of the Mountain Brigade. Bobinet, if you please, Toni Bobinet, a 23-year-old lieutenant in the mountain artillery, based in Annecy, Haute-Savoie, but currently on exercise for 6 weeks in the Aiguille Mountains, where, on a nice day, you can see all the way to Lake Annecy and Geneva to the west, and to the east there is a view of the rounded summit of Mount de Brac and the peak of Mont Blanc. So Lieutenant Toni Bobinet sits on a rock and pulls at his meager mustache, partly because he is bored, and partly also because he has already read the 2-week-old newspaper 5 times, and now he is thinking. At this point, the chronicler ought really to be following the thoughts of this future Napoleon, but for the time being, his thoughts, i.e. the chronicler's, slide down the icy slopes to the Arles Valley, where the thaw is already underway, and where his attention is drawn to the little towns of Megève, Flumet, and Ugine, where the spires on the churches appear like a jumble of children's toys. Ah, dreams of childhood! Oh, those memories of tiny building blocks. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Bobinet... But no. Let us first try to understand the psychology of this great man, examine the first embryonic thoughts of this titan, and put them into words. But this is more than we are capable of, and even if we were capable, we might well find these thoughts disappointing. In short, simply, imagine someone such as little Lieutenant Bobinet sitting up there in the mountains while Europe falls into a state of collapse all around him. He has a battery of mountain artillery with him, and at his feet he can see the tiny world which, from where he is sitting, he could very comfortably bombard with his guns. In that outdated issue of the Moniteur d'Annecy, he has just read a leader article in which some Monsieur Babillard calls for a strong hand to take the rudder and guide the ship of France out of these insane tempests, and on to new glories and new powers. Imagine the lieutenant here, in the pure mountain air, more than 2,000 meters above the sea, where your thoughts are limpid and free. Imagine all of this, and understand that Lieutenant Bobinet, sitting here on his rock, ruminates and then writes to his venerable, wizened, white-haired mother a somewhat confused letter, telling her she will soon be hearing about her Toni, and that her Toni has ideas of magnificence. Then he did a few small jobs, slept well that night, and in the morning he called the troops of his battery together, deposed the old and incompetent captain, took command of the police station down in Sallanches, declared war on the Absolute just as Napoleon would have done, and then he went back to bed. The next day he destroyed the carburetor in the bakery in Thun, occupied the railway station in Bonneville, and took control of the military headquarters in Annecy, by which time he was in command of 3,000 men. Within a week he had destroyed more than 200 carburetors, and was commander of 15,000 infantry and swordsmen in Grenoble. Declared commander-in-chief of Grenoble, he had a small army of 40,000 men behind him. Then he used his long-range guns to carefully clear the territory of all the atomic motors ahead of him and marched down into the Rhone Valley. On the road to Chambéry he captured the Minister of War, who had come out in a car to talk some sense into him. The following day the minister had clearly been entirely won over by Bobinet's plans and appointed him to the rank of general. By the 1st of April the Absolute had been eradicated from Lyon. Until this point Bobinet's victorious ascent had been achieved without a great deal of bloodshed. It was only once he had crossed the river Loire that he met with resistance, mostly from dedicated Catholics and in areas devoted to the Grand Regime. It was fortunate for Bobinet that many people in France had remained skeptical about the Absolute, even in the towns and villages which used its carburetors. In fact, there were many whose skepticism and belief in Enlightenment values was a wild fanaticism. After so many deaths and repeats of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, Les Bobinets were welcomed as liberators everywhere they went, and they did indeed try to achieve a gradual return to peaceful conditions once they had smashed all the carburetors. So, in July of that year, the French Parliament declared that Toni Bobinet has performed a great service to la patrie, appointed him marshal, and awarded him the title of first consul. France had been consolidated. Bobinet declared France an atheist state. Any sign of religion would be punishable by death in accordance with martial law. There are some scenes from the life of this great man that we could not possibly pass over in silence. Bobinet and his mother. One day in at Versailles, Bobinet was in council with his chiefs of staff. It was a warm day, so he was sitting near the open window. Suddenly, out in the park, he saw an old woman warming herself in the sun. Bobinet interrupted what Marshal Jolivet was saying and called out, "Oh look, there's my mother." All the men present, even generals hardened by war, had a tear in their eyes at this sign of filial love. Bobinet and his love for his homeland. One day, in the rain, Bobinet was inspecting his troops on the Champ de Mars. While a brigade of heavy artillery was passing by, one of the vehicles drove through a large puddle, splashing muddy water onto Bobinet's coat. Marshal Jolivet wanted to punish the commander of the unfortunate battery and ordered him to be demoted on the spot, but Bobinet held him back. "It doesn't matter, Marshal. This is, after all, the mud of France." Bobinet and the invalid. One time, Bobinet went to Chartres incognito. On the way, one of the tires burst, and while the driver was changing it, they were approached by a one-legged beggar asking for alms. "How did this man lose his leg?" Bobinet asked. The invalid told him that he had lost it as a soldier in Indochina, and that he had a poor old mother, and that they often had to go without food for days at a time. "Marshal, make a note of this man's name," Bobinet said, clearly touched. And indeed, a week later, Bobinet's personal courier knocked on the door of the man's hovel and handed the poor invalid a parcel from the First Consul. Imagine the joy and amazement on the invalid's face when he opened the parcel and found there a bronze medal. With all the qualities of this outstanding mind, it is no wonder that Bobinet finally yielded to the yearnings of all his people, and, on the 14th of July, he declared himself, to wild public applause, Emperor of the French. The period that followed was certainly very disturbing for the whole world, but it was also a period of greatness. All parts of the globe were at war, and all of them literally glittered with acts of heroism. Seen from Mars, our planet must have shone like a star of the first magnitude, and Martian astronomers would have supposed it was still in the stage of being red hot. And you should understand that France, with its knights and with its leader, Emperor Toni Bobinet, was in no way less resplendent than other countries. Perhaps also some remaining traces of the absolute played a part here, if they had not all evaporated into space, and drove the French nation on to a spirit that went ever higher and ever more fiery. In short, when the great Caesar made an announcement 2 days after his coronation, declaring that the hour had come for France to plant its flag on every part of the world, the nation answered him with a unanimous and enthusiastic shout. Bobinet's plan was thus. 1. Occupy Spain and gain control of the entrance to the Mediterranean by conquering Gibraltar. 2. Occupy the valley of the Danube as far as Pest, and thus control the entrance to the European interior. 3. Occupy Denmark, and thus control the northern seas. And as gaining control of territory usually costs blood, France sent out 3 different armies, all of whom brought her great fame and glory. A 4th army was sent out to Asia Minor to control the way to the Orient. A 5th took control of the St. Lawrence River, as the key to North America. A 6th was drowned in a naval battle off the coast of England. A 7th laid siege to Sevastopol. By New Year's Eve 1944, in the pocket of his artillery trousers, Emperor Bobinet had the keys to all parts of the world. This recording is under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Share-alike license. Music was composed by Johan Halvorsen and performed by the United States Marine Band. The book was written by Karel Čapek, translated by David Wyllie, and performed by Francis Bass.